Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for being here, Alex.
Thank you for having me.
No problem. I mean, as you know, we're here to talk about the future of the home. The way that we live obviously has drastically changed in the last century, particularly thanks to technology. So, I mean, clearly the term internet we have a lot of familiarity with, and the term AI is gaining ground. But how does the term Internet of Things fit within that paradigm?
Well, the term Internet of Things was coined in 2001, so we actually have a very short period of time with that term compared to artificial intelligence, which is a term that's been around since the 60s. And I think that we're constantly negotiating what we mean by those terms through the work that we do. So AI these days might mean something that's associated with the gig economy, because I can use my mobile phone to access a piece of mobility or to access food in ways that I wouldn't have been able to do before, because I know exactly where the closest restaurants are, and they know exactly where their couriers are or where their cars are. And so that new way of looking at information is how we interpret artificial intelligence now. Whereas 60 years ago it would have been, you know, computation and what computation can do for us and our infrastructure and can bring to the ways in which we live back then. So I think we're constantly negotiating around these terms, and Internet of Things now might mean a connected thermostat, it might mean connected lighting, it might mean connected scales for you to know, if you're doing well in your diet. It can kind of mean those things, or it can mean all of the data that we're gathering with the things around us and then what we can do with that data. So depending on context, depending on who has a stake in the conversation, then they tend to use AI and IoT in different ways, I think.
I mean, I know that the Internet of Things is a notion that you've reflected on in your new book about smart homes. Could you tell me a bit about the context of that term and where the term smart home derives from?
Well, I think that the term smart home is really interesting because it comes from the mid-'80s, from a time where personal computing was starting to come into our lives. Some early adopters would have bought their first ever computer at that point. And we have people who have been looking at mainframe computing for a really long time, who are thinking, what can we do in the home space that blends this personal computing revolution with the rest of the home? And the first ever project to come close to the term smart home is actually an American project called Smart House. And this is a project that came out of a building association in the US.
When was this?
This is 1985, 87.
Okay.
And so these builders, really people who were working in plumbing, electrical infrastructure, building materials for the home, put on an event. And they created an event called the Smart House event. It was the first time that that term had really been used. Many thousands of people actually attended this event, and they trademarked this term. So they ended up trademarking the term smart house. And so because they trademarked it and they patented this concept, people couldn't use it. And so they started using smart home, because it's not smart house, because that was protected. And so the idea of smartness comes really from that group of people in the US.
I mean, I know one idea that you have reflected on in your book is our kind of psychological interaction with technology. And when you talked about, the limitations currently of smart appliances, I wondered if that was a factor. Would you be able to tell us a bit about how you've talked about the interaction between humanity and technology in your book?
I talk a lot about, but there's many aspects I talk about in the book, but one that I'll mention quickly is attention. So the idea of having remote access to my washing machine means that suddenly in my day as a professional, when I leave the house, I suddenly have to take time in my day to think about my washing machine. And that's something that I wouldn't necessarily have done before. It's not necessarily something that I welcome, but it's something that we're being pushed to do. So I'm being made to care even more about a space that already attracts quite a lot of expense. We spend a lot of money related to our home. We spend a lot of money related to purchases inside the home, but now it's even extended to the rest of our lives, even when we're not in the home. So I talk a little bit about that, and I think that that's a fascinating way in which industry and fast-moving goods companies and technology companies can take over our work life in the same way that our work life has bled into our home life.
You've mentioned women a couple of times. I was wondering how gendered this debate is. Do you think this idea of convenience is being sold to women in particular?
Yes, absolutely. I think that women still own the majority of purchases in the home. The majority of decision-making, especially around interior design, especially around the mechanics of the home, is still extremely gendered. And we know that from the gender pay gap we experience, the way in which maternity leave is dealt with in particular countries. In this country, in the US, this is still a woman's domain. And this is a domain where the mechanisms to sell to women haven't really changed much.
What about the privacy issue? To what degree are we selling our data in exchange for these so-called conveniences?
I think that we have this, again, constant to and fro between what we consider private and public. We will take pictures of our children and put them on Instagram because we want to share that experience with others. Thus, I think something that 10 years ago would have been seen as quite weird. Like, why are you putting your child on the internet at age, 0, 1 month old, 2 months old? And you can literally now see people share their child as they grow up online. Is this done and sold in the same way as, let's say, a smart speaker that might be selling your conversations on to a third party somewhere else via a server somewhere in the US when you're sitting in your London apartment? We interpret that differently. But it's much more revealing to put photos of your interiors and your life online. Yeah. But we don't live those experiences in the same way. And so we're hypocritical about what we're willing to share, pictures of our babies, versus what we're unwilling to share, conversations about day-to-day life.
But do you think that smart appliances will start to mine our data in different ways, in which, say, a radio, which is kind of projecting information but not absorbing it, can't?
I think that an appliance has always been a form of information for someone. So in the Second World War, you could listen to a piece of audio in someone's home and you could break down that audio to understand which appliance was turned on in the background. So that's something that we've been able to do since the Second World War. Now we might have more information on how often someone, washes their clothes because they're a new mom and the washing machine is on twice a day. Does that then turn into more ads for tablets or new washing liquid? Maybe. Is that something that we don't have right now? No, we have that right now. It's just done differently. It's done through other forms of online advertising.
So are we basically saying that what could be a kind of a downside to smart appliances invading our homes is actually just an extension of what is already there and therefore isn't really an issue? Or do you think that we do need some barriers and that we do need to be a little more conscious of what we're sharing and how?
I think that our ability to have any control over what happens with advertising business models right now is limited.
Can we not simply choose not to have these appliances if we want to opt out?
Precisely. And that's something that I think the average consumer can start having very public conversations around. People will also share benefits versus downsides with their friends over particular appliances. Someone might want to interact with their washing machine in the middle of their day. Someone might not. Right now we're in a marketplace where you will have most people still have a fridge or a washing machine that is 15 years old that is not smart. But when you go to a retailer now and you try to buy something that is dumb, That's more limited. But there's still a secondary market that is full of these dumb appliances. In 20, 30 years, that'll no longer be the case. Will we have moved on in terms of our concerns? Perhaps. But I think that we've always had them, and we'll always have this conversation.
Okay. I know that one thing you've been thinking about, particularly in your book, is how visions of the future from the past have influenced technology today. Would you be able to tell me a bit about that?
Well, I think that the models that we've used in order to sell technology in the home space have changed. We've used the model of efficiency. That was very much a pre-World War and kind of First World War model. The home has to work like an efficient machine. And that's a model that worked really well when people were trying to electrify people's homes. Then we moved on to a model where it was much more about convenience, and convenience is softer. So efficiency versus convenience. Convenience feels nicer, more accessible. It feels like it's about pleasure. And that comes in when we see things like television. Television is there for pleasure. It's about entertainment. So why buy television? Because I'm going to have a pleasurable experience, and I can have the same experience of going to the theater, but at home. And then we end up in the computing age with, well, I'm not even sold convenience, nor am I sold efficiency, but I'm sold the idea of the future. We don't know what it's going to do, but we know that it's coming. The first ads for computers in kind of the personal computer revolution, in a sense, had examples of uses in the home that were completely ridiculous. But people didn't need those arguments. They just knew that this was coming. They knew that this was the thing to do. And I think that that's also informed the last 10 years or so, where people feel like they're waiting for that core example of what the smart home might look like, but maybe they won't even need that. They'll just buy a smart speaker because, well, it's the new thing. It's the thing to do.
So do you think that our fascination with smart appliances isn't just about functionality, but it's also about novelty?
Yes, absolutely. And it's about constantly buying into this idea that we're evolving, and we're, very slowly evolving socially, but we're very rapidly evolving technically. And so we think that the technical evolution enables us to also gain socially. Sometimes that's the case, sometimes it's not. But we negotiate our ideas of the future in this way. We try to buy our way into a future, and hopefully that then changes the landscape and the social landscape around us. Sometimes it doesn't.
Well, you obviously have a very balanced perspective. So thank you very much for sharing it with us.
Thank you for having me.
No problem.